Hey everybody! I'm in between semesters teaching at the local college, so I've been trying to focus on creating artwork over the summer, at least when I'm not freelancing or prepping for my fall design theory class. This particular piece began as an illustration and lettering project with Copic markers. I'm trying to get a little bit better with that since most of my experience tends to be pretty much just with graphite. But I did know that I wanted to turn this into a print, which meant that I needed to take it into Adobe Illustrator to clean things up. So a lot of my digital artwork does begin in sketchbooks. So with that, I've developed kind of a system when I vector both my illustrations and my lettering work. So first of all comes the setup, of course, and this goes pretty similarly for me with every digital piece that I work on. So I'm using a CMYK color space from the get-go because I know that I'll be making prints of this and I want to make sure that I'm mixing my colors properly, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. I also place a scan of the original artwork in the pasteboard of my Illustrator document. I don't like starting in the artboard because I feel really limited by the constraints of the page when I really just want to focus on creating the shapes of my artwork first. That way, when I do finally move to the artboard, I can use those constraints to focus on the layout of the rest of the piece. So after that, I'll move the artwork to its own layer beneath the layer that I'll be drawing on. I'll double-click on that layer to open Illustrator's layer properties. Then I lock and dim any of the photos to about 50%. That helps me focus more on what I'm doing in the foreground while I still get to have that ghosted artwork as a guide in the background. You'll see in a little bit that I also place some reference photos of both Tina and then Linda too. I want to have them to look at as I'm drawing my own versions. I don't want to copy what exists, but I do want to have it there to influence my own take on their design. Finally, coming back to color, I always delete all of my swatches from the swatches panel so that I can mix my own colors. And you'll notice in my swatches panel that each of the thumbnails for my colors have a little corner missing in the bottom right corner. That signifies that I have created global colors when I created those swatches. If you're not familiar with global colors, they function really similarly to how swatches work in InDesign. So if you use a global color to apply fills and strokes to your objects, you can open any of those swatches at any time and end up remixing the colors. That way, once you remix those colors and save, it'll apply those changes to every instance where that swatch is applied. It really helps make sure that your artwork stays consistent, and it helps make sure you don't have to go searching for every object and then update it individually. So now I want to talk about a few things I do when I'm drawing in Illustrator. So look at how I'm building my shapes. There's a few things going on here. I'm making sure that they overlap one another because I don't want to have any kind of weird gaps where things don't quite line up. I have my smart guides on as well to help with this. I've also noticed that when I'm drawing in Illustrator, sometimes when I have shapes just barely touching but not overlapping, it'll create a weird sort of ghosting thin white line between the shapes that's just absolutely maddening. So building the things the way that I do, having them overlap, helps eliminate the problems that I've encountered throughout my time working in Illustrator. Another thing that you'll notice is my anchor point placement and my handle placement. Those things are really key to my illustrations as well, especially once I get into lettering. Jessica Hish actually recorded a really great video that helped inform how I approach this, and I'll put a link to that in the description box below. But in short, I use really few anchor points so that it gives me a lot more control over my shapes. I'm not having to take the time to click a million times and create potentially jagged edges, and if I need to edit the shape in the future, I don't have to edit 1,000 anchor points. I just have a few that I can kind of move around here and there, and it'll help me really control the shapes that I'm working with. I also tend to place my handles at 90-degree angles as well. That helps me ensure smoother curves, and it's really more important to me when I'm working with my lettering than with my illustration. I want my lettering to be really consistent and really smooth, but with illustrations like this, I want things to be a little more organic, so I'm less concerned about sticking with those 90-degree angles. Now, one thing my students frequently tell me is that they love watching me work because apparently I'm pretty quick about things. But they tend to not like the reason that I'm so fast. I've taken the time over the past 10 years or so to memorize a lot of keyboard shortcuts to help me work more efficiently. So if you kind of watch me work here for a second, you'll notice that I don't have to continually go up to the menu at the top or over to my tool panel on the left to continually find the kind of tools and panels or options that I need to work. I design with one hand on my keyboard using my muscle memory to find shortcuts and one hand on my mouse so that I can work with the objects and options and everything that way. It really cuts down on time and helps me focus on the artwork that I'm working on and not the specifics of how I'm going about that. Now with this particular illustration, I really wanted it to have a simple look. If you watch Bob's Burgers at all, you'll know that it's pretty simple illustration and animation, but I wanted it to have a really organic feeling as well. I thought rather than spending the time trying to force it to look organic, which I said earlier, I don't want to do, I wanted to use a good Illustrator brush set so that I could apply those brushes to the strokes of my objects and help affect the organicness of it that way. So I ended up using the ink pen brush vector set from the Creative Market user ZZ Market. I'll be sure to place a link to it below. It's pretty inexpensive and it's a really fantastic brush set. It helped me keep my lines really simple, and it's always really fun to play with different brush strokes and see what happens when I edit them. So you'll see me kind of playing around with them, working with a couple of different things that I ended up just going back to the defaults anyway. So the last thing I want to comment on for now is how I created depth with my artwork here. There's three things that I used specifically in this piece. I used different opacities and blending modes with some of my objects. I used raster effects for others, and I paid really close attention to my object and layer placement. So let's start out with talking about the blending modes and opacities. I don't like to work with a lot of colors in pieces like this. I prefer to use a limited palette. You can see I only have 7 or 8 colors here. It's another thing that my global swatches help me with, because I can use tints of a swatch rather than having to mix a new swatch and then create that and add it to my palette. But it also helps when I want to create shadows or highlights, because I can use multiply and adjust the opacity of the different strokes and objects, and that'll help me create a bit of shadow. So you can see I did that with Tina's knees and the folds in her skirt. So the multiply blending mode pretty much just takes whatever color of the object or stroke that you're using, and it darkens anything that goes behind it. Lessening the opacity helps create that more subtle effect, because I don't want things to be particularly harsh if they don't need to be. So using raster effects can be really helpful for creating softer shadows. So where she's holding up her skirt to demonstrate her mother's wisdom, I created a couple of shapes that roughly followed the contour of her hand and the folds of her skirt. Then I used a Gaussian blur and the trusty multiply blending mode to create that soft shadow that her skirt is casting on her gloriously hairy thighs. Finally, I used my object and layer placements to create depth as well. I talked a little earlier about overlapping my shapes, and I took that a step further with some of these options, like placing the large weird shadow shapes behind her hand and top skirt layer, but above the back of the skirt and her leg. I created a bit of a frame at the top and bottom with the blue and red blocks of color, and ended up pulling Tina's body over top of that frame to create a bit of depth and visual interest. Then I placed Linda's iconic hair and glasses within the frame so it appears that she's further back than Tina, almost hinting that she's the voice in the back of Tina's head when she's shaving only to her knees. I do this really quickly with 2 keyboard shortcuts, Control or Command if you're working on a Mac, and the bracket symbols, which are just up and a little to the left of your Enter or Return key. Control or Command left bracket moves objects backwards in your layer order, while Control or Command and the right bracket moves them forward in the layer order. It's really helpful when you're doing this to group a bunch of your items as well, so that if you're working on something that's really intricate, far more intricate than this piece, you're not endlessly having to hold those keys down until your object appears where you want it to. So with that, I'll let you go ahead and finish watching the video, and I'll see you at the end to kind of wrap things up. So from start to finish, it took me about 2 hours to fully vector this. I hope the video is helpful to the designers and illustrators of you out there watching this. Is there anything that I missed that would have expedited? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to see more videos similar to this, be sure to like the video. That'll help me know that I can record more process videos. And if you'd like to help me continue to create content like this and some of the other educational projects that I want to start here, go over to Patreon and you can support me for as little as $1 a month. That's really going to help me to take care of some of those residual pesky monthly expenses so that I can really focus on creating more artwork and design work and educational things for you guys. So thanks so much. I appreciate the time you took to be with me today, and I'll see you next time.